Today, I'll be telling this story a little bit differently. I'd like you to just hear the story. Picture it in your mind. I won't be including any images as this is meant to be heard. And I want each individual to imagine it in their own way, without visual cues. When you're finished with the story, tell me what you imagined in the comments. He looked out at the auburn sky as the sun began to set over the Red River Gorge in east central Kentucky. A bit nervous, partially terrified of what this second night would bring. But in this moment, he was resigning himself to the fact that this would not matter to anyone but him. The light breeze gently flowed through his gray hair as he just looked out over the horizon and over the canyon beneath his feet, perched like a hawk on a rock, his favorite rock, called Half Moon, for its dome-like shape which stood above the tree line. It was a miracle the man could even hike up, but it was of no matter. The glistening leaves gently swayed in the breeze down below as he listened for the familiar sound, the call, as he referred to it in his mind. He knew what it meant, and as afraid as he was, he also welcomed it. This was a man of the wilderness, a figure who lived in the spaces between towns and cities, someone you only ever see at the edge of a trail or along a winding back road. For 60 years, he had roamed across the United States, from the towering peaks of Montana's crazy mountains to the windswept ridges of the Pacific crest. The outdoors was all he had known, the rhythm of his life dictated by the seasons and the trails he followed. There were no family photos tucked into his pack, no one waiting for him back in a warm home. He had never married, had no children. His relationships had been like the rivers he camped beside, brief, passing, and always moving away. He was a solitary creature, content to be a whisper among the trees, a shadow in the wild places where few dared to venture. But time had a way of eroding even the strongest mountains, and it had taken its toll on him. His legs no longer had the same spring. His arms no longer carried the same strength. The distances that once stretched like endless invitations now felt like insurmountable challenges. His muscles ached. His bones groaned under the weight of years spent in the wilderness. Now his adventures were confined to weekends, short trips, nothing too strenuous, but enough to keep the embers of his wanderlust alive. It was on one such weekend that he found himself in the Red River Gorge, a place he had first explored decades ago, when his body was young and full of vigor. The Red River Gorge was not the most remote place he had been, not even close, but there was something about its beauty that had always stayed with him. The way the sandstone cliffs caught the last light of day, the thick forests that stretched endlessly beneath them, and the river that cut through it all like a silver thread. This place had called to him when he was younger, teaching him how to survive, how to read the land and live with the wild. And now, in his twilight years, it called to him again. He drove down a gravel road, the loose stones rattling under his tires as the forest swallowed him whole. There were other campers in the distance, their fires faint pinpricks of light flickering through the trees, but he didn't pay them much attention. He was used to solitude. Other people were just passing distractions, and this weekend was his own. He found a small clearing at the edge of the forest, far enough from the main trails that it felt like his own private piece of wilderness, but not so far that it would be hard to leave. The sun was sinking low when he set up camp, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The fire crackled in front of him, the warmth seeping into his bones as he sat on a log, staring into the flames. The sound of the Indian River, distant but constant, was a comforting backdrop to the quiet night. As he watched the fire dance, his thoughts wandered through the memories of his past. He remembered the nights spent under open skies, the endless miles of trails, the way the world felt vast and unknowable when he was younger. He had been fearless then, driven by a need to explore, to conquer the land around him. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, he felt a different kind of weight, a heaviness that came from knowing the best days of his life were behind him. The quiet night was interrupted by a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a rustling in the trees, something moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. His ears, attuned to the wilderness after decades of listening to its every whisper, caught it immediately. He tensed his hand instinctively, reaching for the pistol at his side. It could have been anything. Deer, raccoons, maybe even another camper wandering too far off the trail. But as the noise persisted, he realized it wasn't just an animal. The sounds were too deliberate, too aware. There was a rhythm to the movement, as if something was watching, waiting. He stoked the fire, the flames jumping higher as the orange light flickered across the trees. Shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, dark figures shifting in and out of sight. His heart pounded, a slow, steady beat in his chest, but he refused to give in to fear. He had spent his life in the wild, faced down storms and predators, survived when others would have faltered. This was no different. It was just the wilderness playing tricks on him. Then came the laughter, soft at first, a child's giggle carried on the wind. It was distant but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down his spine. The fire crackled louder, as if responding to the sound, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to thicken, growing darker, deeper. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. Eyes, watching from the blackness, waiting for something. He rose from his seat, the pistol in his hand now, and fired a single shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the trees, and for a moment the forest was silent. Then laughter came again, closer this time, and along with it a low groan, like the sound of wood bending under pressure, a deep creaking noise that made his skin crawl. He felt a presence now, something just beyond the firelight, lurking in the shadows. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there. He had spent his life in the wild, and he had never felt anything like this before, and he'd been through some pretty tough situations. He retreated into his tent, his mind racing, but his body too tired to flee. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd hear something. Footsteps, laughter, whispers just beyond his hearing. The wind rustled the trees, and the shadows seemed to move on their own against the side of his tent, bending toward the tent as though to draw to him. Hours passed like this, the fire dying out, the darkness closing in until finally exhaustion claimed him. Morning arrived with the soft light of dawn, but it brought no comfort. The camp was eerily still, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and leaves. His fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered as if something had walked through them. He found tracks in the dirt, strange, elongated impressions that didn't match any animal he knew. They circled his tent, never straying too far, but close enough to make him feel trapped, surrounded. He packed up his gear, trying to shake off the unease that had settled into his bones. The day was clear, the sun filtering through the trees in golden beams that made the forest seem less ominous, less threatening. But as he hiked along the trails that wound through the gorge, the feeling of being watched never left him. He took paths less traveled, ones that wound deeper into the woods, away from the tourists and weekend hikers. This had always been his way, find the places where no one else went, where the wilderness still had its secrets. But today it felt different. Every time he rounded a bend or passed through a narrow ravine, he heard the faintest echo of laughter. It was distant, elusive, but unmistakable. His eyes scanned the treetops, the undergrowth, searching for the source of the sound, but he saw nothing, only the endless green of the forest and the shadows that clung to the ground like ghosts. The laughter wasn't alone. There were other sounds now, groans, whispers, the occasional crack of branches underfoot, but never close enough to see. He felt it again that night, sitting by his fire, the flames casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. The noises started earlier this time, the rustling in the trees more distant. He stoked the fire, trying to keep the light bright, but it did little to push back the darkness. And then he saw it, a shape, pale and ghostly, standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, with limbs that seemed to move unnaturally, like they were made of mist. Its body was white, not glowing, but reflecting the moonlight in a way that made it seem otherworldly. Its eyes were coal black, deep pits that seemed to swallow the light around them, and its fingers were long, impossibly thin, like whips of wind that stirred the leaves around it without making a sound. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The sight of it was enough to paralyze him with fear. He had faced bears, wolves, storms that could have killed him, but nothing had ever made him feel this way, helpless, insignificant, like a speck of dust caught in a storm too vast to comprehend. The creature watched him, its dark eyes unblinking, and for the first time in his life, he really felt truly alone. It didn't belong to this world, this thing. It was something ancient, something that had always been here, waiting. He had spent his life chasing the wilderness, searching for the unknown, and now he had found it. Or maybe it had found him. The fire flickered, dying down to embers, and the creature stepped closer. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, like it was made of smoke and shadow, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The cold seeped into his bones deeper than anything he had ever felt, a cold that came from the creature itself. And then it reached for him, those long fingers stretching out, brushing against his skin. The cold was unbearable, and as the last light of fire died, he felt the darkness close in. His heart slowed, his breath shallow. The moonlight flickered through the branches above, casting dim silver streaks across his trembling hands. The creature's touch was ice, unforgiving and absolute. As it leaned closer, its pale face grew clearer in the failing light. There were no features, no mouth, no expression, just those bottomless black eyes that drank in the light, reflecting nothing back. It was as though it had come from the depths of the earth, from a place that light had never touched. The air around him felt heavy, pressing down on his chest. He gasped, but no air came in. His lungs burned, every breath a futile attempt to escape the suffocating presence. He wasn't sure if he was still alive or already dead, suspended in a nightmare that felt too real. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, but the more he thought, the more the answer slipped away. There was no logic here, no explanation, just the creature and the void it carried with it. The laughter returned, this time closer, echoing from all directions. It wasn't the laughter of a child, but something twisted, mocking. It reverberated through the trees, bouncing off the cliffs and swirling around him until he could no longer tell if it was inside his head or outside. The trees swayed unnaturally, their limbs creaking and groaning like ancient dying things. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of the wind seemed to be in conversation with the creature, as if the very forest was alive and complicit in what was happening. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body refused to obey his commands, frozen in place, as if rooted to the earth like the trees around him. His vision blurred as the pale figure loomed over him, its black eyes drawing him deeper into a darkness he couldn't resist. He wanted to fight, to push it away, but his strength had long since abandoned him. His heart, once steady and strong, faltered now, each beat slower than the last. The figure seemed to grow taller, more imposing. As it leaned in closer, it was as though the world itself was bending around it, warping reality in its presence. The man, if he could still be called that, felt the cold seep into his bones, deeper and deeper, until he could no longer feel anything at all. Time stretched out, endless and cruel, as the creature's fingers wrapped around him, pulling him into the void it carried with it. For a moment, everything was still. The forest, the sky, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with one final breath, he disappeared. When the sun rose, it brought with it its warmth, golden light that bathed the forest in soft hues of amber and green. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs filling the air with a sense of normalcy that belied the events of the night. The clearing where he had made camp was undisturbed. His tent remained where he had packed it. The fire pit, cold but intact. The only thing missing was the man. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no pack left behind, no trace that anyone had ever been there, other than his tent. The place where he had sat by the fire, where he had once stared into the flames, was nothing more than an empty spot on the forest floor. The grass stood tall, untouched. The forest had reclaimed him, as if he had never existed at all. The other campers, if they had even heard the faint gunshot from the night before, thought nothing of it. The wilderness was vast, and people came and went all the time. It wasn't unusual for someone to spend a night and leave before dawn, vanishing into the trails without a word. No one thought to look for the man. He had always been a man who moved through the life like a ghost, passing unnoticed, leaving no trace. As the hours passed, the forest grew quieter. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the trees. But if you stood still just for a moment, you could hear it. The faintest echo of laughter carried on the wind. It drifted through the trees, distant and ghostly, a reminder of something that had happened, or perhaps something that had never happened at all. He had come to the Red River Gorge, his favorite place in the world, for one last weekend in the wilderness. But in the end, it was as though he had never been there. He was a nameless figure, lost to the wilds he had loved, swallowed by the very land he had spent his life exploring. This was the place he had chosen to die, alone, forgotten, and at peace with the silence that followed. And now, as the forest settled into its familiar rhythm, it was as if he had never existed at all. I hope you've enjoyed this story. If you did, don't forget to like, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. You won't want to miss another story. I'm trying to produce more of them right now. So, let me know what you think in the comments. Until the next time, stay weird.